Okay, so I'm going to talk about sex in the census and why surveys should not conflate sex and gender. So I'm just going to talk briefly on the census sex guidance, and then I'm going to move on to why sex matters in data collection and analysis. I agree completely, it goes way beyond the census. I'm going to explain what I see as three distinct concepts which I think are being muddled, which is sex, gender, and gender identity. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we got here. So policy capture, silencing, and finally the ethical implications and then conclusions. So the proposed guidance to accompany the sex question in the 2021 census advises respondents to answer in terms of their gender identity. And so I won't get into the precise wordings because different versions of the guidance are being used in different UK countries, which therein lies another story, and that's probably not very helpful in itself either. But there's also a new voluntary question on gender identity, which is going to be included, and that's great. But I argue that we need clear and distinct variables on both of those because both of them are important and they're different. So we've had data on sex collected in the census since 1801. There was no guidance until 2011 because, of course, nobody thought the concept of sex was needing guidance until then. 2011 guidance was introduced without any consultation, very much under the radar. And it's unclear how many people would have looked at it. But of course, the switch to online first in 2021 makes the guidance more visible. There's been much more debate about the guidance this time around, which will have raised awareness. And crucially, of course, as has been raised already, there's far more people now with trans and non-binary identities. And so it makes it likely that the impact of the guidance will be greater, which could affect continuity over time in the census, which is, of course, really, really important. Also crucial, this goes way beyond the census because people do tend to see the census as the gold standard and copy both the questions and the guidance. So this will influence other data collection exercises, there's no doubt. And so if it goes through, it will lead to a wider loss of data on sex. But we're already seeing a loss of data on sex, and I'll give you some examples. So in terms of employment and pay, ACAS, in terms of monitoring the gender pay gap at firm level, advise that data should be categorized by gender identity, not sex, and even that data on non-binary people can be excluded from data on the firm's gender pay gap. In terms of crime, police forces are recording crimes by men as though they were committed by women if the perpetrator requests it. In terms of health, if you replace the person's sex with their gender identity on medical records, that, of course, has implications for research using admin data. And we've talked about the numbers. Well, the fact is we don't have really good numbers on how many people are trans or non-binary. We do know that among some subgroups, it's certainly non-negligible. So to take two very different groups, male prisoners and BBC staff, 2% of both of those groups identify as trans. So that's, that's not, it's not negligible. But more importantly than that, we've got growing numbers among youth, especially girls, and we don't know how that's going to change over time. And again, that it could go up over time and then it could go back down over time. We just don't know that. So there's an uncertainty there in terms of how it affects continuity of data. Sorry, I'm struggling to, oh, here we are. So why does sex matter in data collection and analysis? Well, it does matter. It's a fundamental demographic and explanatory variable, and it's absolutely uncontroversial among quantitative social scientists that it matters a lot. It's a very powerful predictor of almost every dimension of social life, whether it's education, the labour market, political attitudes, religion. I mean, it just affects everything. Of course, sex is also a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act, so it's essential for equalities monitoring. So I'll give you a couple of examples of sex and how it matters. This slide shows the sex ratio at birth in a number of different countries. And you can see that, for example, in China and India, there are far more boys born than girls. And the reason for that is very straightforward. It's because males have a higher status than females in those societies, which means that there is sex-selective abortion before birth, because obviously sex is determined at conception and observed well before birth. Another example is crime. So sex affects everything, but violent crime in particular is something that's really, really powerfully predicted by sex. So, of course, most men are not violent criminals, but the vast majority of violent criminals are men. So 94% of convicted murderers. Actually, the majority of murder victims as well are male. If we look at sexual offences, 97% of perpetrators are male, and the vast majority of victims, of adult victims of sex offences, are female. So you can see that when you're starting from such a skewed baseline and such very small numbers of actual female perpetrators, a small amount of error in terms of, a few people being misclassified as women when they're actually male could have quite dramatic biasing effects on the data. Now, we know that women have historically been second-class citizens when it comes to data, and it's great that people are finding out about that from Caroline Criado Perez' book on Invisible Women. But until recently, it has to be said, government agencies have recognised the need to gather sex-based data. So why are we now actually losing data on sex, just as we seem to be recognising more than ever how important it is? Well, I think the reason is that there's a confusion between three distinct concepts. So we've talked about sex and gender. I'm going to talk about sex, gender, and gender identity. So sex is biological, it's determined at conception, and it's a binary category. Gender is social. So sociologists talk about gender as referring to the stereotypes and social roles that are imposed on people because of how others perceive us. And the term gender has been used for a long time to kind of emphasize that differences in how we live and things that we might face, like the gender pay gap, are not directly biologically determined. There's also a social process there. It doesn't mean biology doesn't matter, because of course the stereotypes are imposed on people according to their biology. Then gender identity is the third thing. It's psychological rather than biological or social, and it refers to how people feel about themselves, whether that doesn't match their biology, and also perhaps doesn't match how others see them as well. So there are three distinct concepts here, and they're increasingly being conflated in data collection. So where does this confusion come from? It's partly, I think, people can be a bit squeamish about using the word sex, and they like to use gender instead because it sounds more polite, and you know that you're not talking about the act. But it's also, I think, it's important to understand where this comes from theoretically, and it comes from postmodern queer theory. This idea that sex is a spectrum, or that there are more than two sexes. That's not because there's been some amazing biological research breakthrough and they've found more than two sexes. That comes from queer theory. The idea that being non-binary means you don't have sex. The idea that intersex people, or people with differences of sexual development, are somehow a third sex, or that that's a gender identity. And as Ian has mentioned, that's quite offensive to many intersex people. The idea that sex is a social construct which is somehow arbitrarily assigned rather than observed. And underpinning all of this, the idea it's offensive to actually acknowledge the existence of biological sex. So I could show you lots of questionnaires that embody these confusions, but the one I'm showing you here is from an NHS inclusion toolkit. And if you look at the first question on the right-hand bar, what's your gender? But then the top two categories are actually sexes, male and female, and then you've got non-binary as though that wasn't a sex, and then other as though there was some other sex. So very muddled. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that accurate data on both sex and gender identity are really important for trans and non-binary people too. We've got to acknowledge that there is something happening here with young people, particularly among young girls. So whereas in previous generations, we had trans people or transsexuals, as we would have talked about then, who were overwhelmingly male, we now see a much more common phenomenon of trans and non-binary gender identities very much among girls. So the idea that the experiences that, let's say, a non-binary young man and young woman, the idea that their experiences on the labour market or in terms of crime or anything else, that it will be unaffected by their sex and the sex that other people perceive them as rather than just their own identity, seems like it's quite a stretch to believe that. And even if you do believe that, you can't actually find out whether that's true without collecting the data. So it's really, really important if we're going to understand the different experiences and and particularly the discrimination and the problems that people with different gender identities might face, we need accurate data on both sex and gender identity. Modelling up the sex data so that that's also about your gender identity does not help. So how have we got here? Well, there's been a process called policy capture, where expert voices have really been silenced and sidelined. So intense lobbying by groups which are promoting the view that sex should be treated as irrelevant and replaced by gender identity, both in law, in language, and in data. So I think Ian was right in his introduction to kind of contextualize this as part of a political movement. So the people lobbying for these changes in data collection are not interested in data collection per se, they're interested in a particular political ideology. And the consequences for those who express the belief in the material reality and the importance of sex, however uncontroversial that is within the scientific and social scientific world, the consequences are severe, and they include no platforming and harassment. And therefore, there's a wider chilling effect where, some people speak up and they're treated very badly. Colleagues look at that and think, God, I want to steer clear of this debate. This is really awful. I'm just not going to say anything about this. It's incredibly unhealthy for research. It's unhealthy for democracy. I can give you an example of this chilling effect. So I collected signatures for a letter to the census authorities expressing the concerns of the scientific community about the guidance on the sex question, saying that, sex is important. We believe that sex rather than gender identity really matters. And a large number of, so 80 people, 80 well-known quantitative social scientists signed it, including 10 fellows of the British Academy. But there were people who were too frightened to sign this letter. And I want to quote to you from a colleague who felt that they were too precariously employed, actually, too insecure to feel that they could sign the letter. And this colleague said to me in an email, which I'm quoting with permission, so with a very heavy heart, I have chosen to swallow my integrity on this particular issue and keep my head down. I don't like doing this. I don't like how it feels. I don't like the implications of my inaction for social justice in general or gender issues in particular. Now, I find this quite heartbreaking and horrifying, and it's like no other issue that I have ever come across in my career. Now, but that colleague, unfortunately, was quite right to have concerns because subsequent to that, I was no platformed. This is for me with pre-lockdown peroxide hair. It's not quite the same now, but I was no platformed by a social research methods seminar organised by the National Centre for Social Research, which I just find that extraordinary. And it was a seminar that included people from ONS as participants. They actually cancelled the entire event rather than include me, and I did a subject data access request to prove that that was what happened, that an LGBT group within that CEN asked for me to be no platformed, and that CEN complied. So that brings us, I think, neatly onto research ethics. I think we all understand that there are duties to participants in research. We've also got to think about the duties to the consumers of research: truth, rigor, accuracy, upholding the integrity of research and public trust in research. Obviously, we never seek to cause gratuitous offence to respondents, but we do often ask sensitive questions in research. There are lots of sensitive questions. If you ask someone for their income, for example, that could be quite a sensitive question. But we don't seek false or muddled information from respondents. We ask them to provide accurate information. I have never in my entire career come across another question where it's been advocated that, well, this is a sensitive question, so we should tell people to give some other information rather than the information we actually want. Finally, in terms of ethics, I think as social scientists, we have a duty to address important social phenomena, to defend science and scholarship in the face of bullying. It's absolutely so crucial that we do that, and that is not happening. So in conclusion, we need accurate data on sex. Without that, we lose the ability to understand and monitor differences, to design evidence-based policies and find out whether those policies are working. Policy capture and silencing are preventing rational discussion and normal scientific processes from being applied to questions on sex and gender identity. And this isn't just a women's issue. Anyone who values evidence-based policy should oppose that. So finally, we shouldn't confuse the concepts of sex and gender identity. They're both important, and we can respect people's identities without pretending that they don't have a sex. We should collect accurate data on both. So thank you very much for the Royal Statistical Society for having this debate and for not no platforming me. If people want to find out more, I have written a paper which this presentation was based on. And there is an open access preprint version of that for those of you who don't have access to the journal. So you can just Google that if you're interested. Thank you very much.